my name is Brittney Wilkins, and for our final major assignment, I did my project on the roles of women in Lady Audley's Secret in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was during the 19th century. During this time period, the social structure of England was changing. Women were given more choices than ever before. They were still very restricted, though. The women's roles in the Victorian era consisted of them taking care of the household. In the article written by K. Broadman, The Ideology of Domestic, there was the concept of the separate spheres for the men and the women. The men were in the public sphere, where they worked outside of the home. They provided for the family. The women were in the domestic sphere. They were in charge of the home. It was their responsibility to make sure that everything ran smoothly in the household. Under the concept of the separate spheres, it was only acceptable for women to work in the household. Lady Audley's Secret was a sensation novel. It was written by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. The main character was Lady Audley. She began her life as Helen, but she wanted to live a high-class lifestyle, so she changed her identity to Lucy. When she marries Sir Michael Audley, who was wealthy, she becomes Lady Audley. Throughout the novel, she was willing to do whatever was necessary in order to maintain her position as Lady Audley. She attempts to murder her ex-husband George because he was getting in the way. She was afraid that he was going to ruin her new lifestyle. Robert starts to investigate Lady Audley because he knows that something isn't right with her. Lady Audley sets the inn on fire to kill Robert, but he actually survives. During the novel, I think that Lady Audley does a spectacular job hiding all of her secrets from her husband until the very end. She finally confesses to her husband about her life, and in the end, she ends up in an insane asylum. In the novel, Lucy marries Michael Audley in order to gain a respectable place in society. Lucy Graham, she then becomes Lady Audley, and her husband is completely dependent upon her. She's much younger than he is, and she rules him in every way. Lady Audley manipulated him with her beauty and charm. She actually cares more about the possessions and the luxuries provided by her husband than she actually cares for him. When I was doing my research, Lynn Vasco made a good point in her article that acts of madness. She believed, as in Lady Audley, believed that marriage was founded not on love or even affection, but on the relief from financial needs. Lady Audley performed the behaviors of marital affection but never felt them. Lady Audley recognized a good marriage as an escape from the horrors of poverty. Another part in my research that I found was Herbert Klein stated in his article, Strong Women and Feeble Men, that Lady Audley gives Sir Michael the illusion that she conforms to the Victorian ideal of womanhood and that he can play the ideal Victorian male, but in reality, she's actually violating the gender, social, and moral boundaries. Lady Audley practices deception and commits crime whenever it is in her own best interest. Lynn Voskuil also states in her Acts of Madness that Braddon created an unnatural monster, a childish, blonde creature who looked the part of the Victorian wife, but who believed that appearance by acting out a brazen materialism and murderous self-assertion. Braddon did indeed, I think, create a monster with Lady Audley. She seemed perfect on the outside, but in the inside, she was evil and only cared about herself. She would do anything in her power, including murdering people who got in her way. And in the end, Lady Audley did get what she deserved. She was defeated by her husband, and she actually tries to make her husband feel bad for her by saying, "You have brought me to my grave, Mr. Audley. You have used your power basely and cruelly and have brought me to a living grave." Lady Audley says this to him because she is now in an insane asylum and she has to deal with her life choices. And I think that she says this because she wants him to feel bad for her. In the Victorian era, the upper class women would have never acted like Lady Audley. From the beginning, she may have looked like a sweet, beautiful, innocent woman, but as you know from the ending of the novel, she was not. The upper-class Victorian women lived a life full of everything that money could buy for them. Queen Elizabeth was their role model. She was the ideal Victorian woman. The upper-class Victorian women were fortunate enough to have money to hire servants to do their household work for them. Lady Audley was one of those fortunate women. She had Phoebe Marks as her servant. She didn't have to do any of her household work. Instead, she could focus on her next plan of attack. The servants in the Victorian era also raised the children as well. Clothing was very important to the Victorian women. Their appearance was everything. And as you know, in Lady Audley's Secret, Lady Audley was always described as being beautiful. Her beauty distracted everyone from her evilness. The upper-class Victorian women were always dressed in fine fabrics, grand dresses, and these set them apart from the other women. Phoebe Marks was Lady Audley's servant. She grew up in miserable circumstances like Lady Audley did when she was once Helen. She portrayed very similar characteristics as Lady Audley throughout the novel. In my research, Natalie Schroeder says in her article called Feminine Sensationism, Exorcism, and Self-Assertion that Phoebe Marks was an adolescent who so closely resembles her mistress that in certain light one could be mistaken for the other. Phoebe and Lady Audley both had the same motives. They were both eager for their own advancement. They were both selfish, cold-hearted, and cruel. Phoebe was a beautiful woman who seemed to be trapped by the social mores of society. She was a servant, but she really wanted to be like Lady Audley. She wanted to live the upper-class lifestyle. Phoebe was afraid of her husband, but she knew that her only way out of poverty was to marry him. And he was actually her cousin. Phoebe commits theft and blackmails Lady Audley. She does this because I think she's jealous of her lifestyle. It is Phoebe's dream to be in the upper class society like Lady Audley. It was actually every poor woman's dream to be in the upper class Victorian society. At the end of the novel, Phoebe is finally free from her husband and is able to live freely without him. Some poor-class women in the Victorian era were servants. They had to cater to the upper-class society. In Lady Audley's Secret, that was Phoebe's role. She was a servant for Sir Michael Audley and Lady Audley. She was expected to cater to them and do all of the household chores. Poor-class women's clothing consisted of rags and cheap clothing. No wonder why Phoebe was jealous of Lady Audley's lifestyle. She had to be around Lady Audley while she was dressed in her fancy, nice clothing, while Phoebe had to wear cheap cloth and rags. The poor class lived in dark and cold homes. Not only were they responsible for the chores and household work for the rich that they worked for, they also had to do their own household work. Their food was tasteless and consisted of anything they could afford. Clara Talboys was another Victorian woman in the novel. She was George's sister, and she was also another woman in the novel who was under the domination of men in the Victorian era. She stays under her father's roof and completely obeys his wishes. She's a very obedient daughter. She never violates the law. In my research, I read something that Herbert Klein stated. Clara, nevertheless, never transgresses from the conventional boundaries of her sex. She does women's work and is an accomplished musician. She obeys her father's wishes until she marries Robert. Another thing was that Clara, she loved her brother George, but since her father had disinherited him, she wasn't allowed to speak of him. She had to hide her feelings when Robert tells the story of events that took place when he believed that George was dead. Clara, an event that happened in the story that I thought was interesting was Clara suddenly stood up and her father states, "Sit down, Clara, and keep your cotton in your workbox." Her father shows that he is in charge of her and in control. It is her duty to remain perfectly quiet and to remain seated until she is asked to do otherwise. Clara did not want to upset her father or go against his will, but she will not stop searching until her brother is found. When Robert insinuates that he might give up on the search, Clara transgresses from her domestic role imposed upon her. She says she will go search for him herself. In the end, Robert marries Clara, and he now can hold on to his belief that women are all the same and that his wife is different from all the others. Clara is the only woman in the novel who truly represents the ideal Victorian woman. Clara is considered as a domestic angel. Her role in the story changed from being a domestic daughter to now a domestic wife. Young ladies in the Victorian era were constantly being chaperoned. They had strict rules to follow. Clara was not exempt from these rules. Her father gave her very strict rules and boundaries that were set in place for her, such as the outward appearance and social behavior. Clara always made sure to follow the rules. It was the father's duty to be the head of the household. They provided financial stability for their children as well as their wives. Living in a wealthy family, you always had nice clothes and nice shoes to wear, and the fathers were the ones who provided the ultimate authority over his children. And in the novel, Clara's father definitely was in this role. He made sure that Clara knew that he had authority over her, and she always made sure that she would obey him. The roles of women in Lady Audley's Secret versus the roles of women during the Victorian era were very different. Women in the Victorian era were seen as second best to the men. They were seen as the trophy wife, mother. The women were expected to be content with this role in society. In the novel, the women attempted to rebel against the conventional feminine ideal. By committing bigamy and murder, Lady Audley achieved her dreams of marrying a wealthy man and living the lifestyle she always dreamed of until she was, in the end, locked away in the insane asylum. In the novel, both Lady Audley and Phoebe manipulated others in order to gain a better social position for themselves. They went against the ideal Victorian social norm for women of the time period. Clara was one of the only women who actually obeyed the Victorian role for the women. She obeyed her father, never violated the social norm, and did what women should have done during the Victorian era. Every woman in the novel suffered to varying degrees from the men in their lives. Thanks, I hope you enjoy my presentation.